Okay, welcome to part two of demand and supply. So, in the initial demand and supply lectures that you watched, we learned about kind of how do we construct the demand curve, what's the intuitive meaning behind it, same with the supply curve, laws of demand and supply, learned about the equilibrium, right? Combine them together. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. When you get a shift in demand or supply, what happens? A little bit on how to use algebra with it. A whole lot of really good stuff. Here we take that into a whole new level. So we start to look at economic efficiency, government price setting, taxes. So let's begin. Okay, welfare of consumers and producers. So demand and supply, that gives us price, quantity. What we want to do now is look at how good is this outcome, right? How good of an outcome is the equilibrium? So how well off are consumers and producers? And we're able to tell this by the price in the market, which equilibrium price, and the demand curve and the supply curve, right? The curves themselves. So the well-being, the concepts of the well-being for consumers, the term is it's consumer surplus. For producers, to describe how well off or how happy they are with the market outcome, it's producer surplus. And just a note here, when we talk about the welfare of consumers and producers, we are referring to the well-being of this isn't not the government program welfare, it's the well-being of consumers and producers based on the market outcome. So we start with consumer surplus. So our demand curve, if you recall, it shows us the preferences a consumer has for buying a product, right? Another way we phrased it is the willingness to pay. You name a price, tell you what quantity, or if there's a quantity, we know what price the consumers would be willing to pay for that quantity. Well, if the willingness to pay is above the market price, we call this consumer surplus. We would say that the consumer is receiving consumer surplus. And consumer surplus, it's defined simply as the difference between how much a consumer thinks the product is worth, and by think it's worth, we're thinking very objectively in how much is he or she willing to pay for it right now, if he or she had to. Right? If you had to pay this, what would be the absolute most you'd pay? And the difference between that maximum you'd be willing to pay and the price you'd have to pay, that's consumer surplus. So let's think through a simple example here. Suppose that your favorite band or musician comes to your hometown for a concert. Right? Your favorite band musician comes to the concert, or say they come to Selinsgrove, right? So, Susquehanna gets in a good number of musical acts. And for this particular band, right, the most you'd pay is $35. You think, if I had to go see this band, I would spend $35. Well, if the price is only $20, you've just received $15 in consumer surplus, right? You were ready to pay $35 if you had to, but you didn't have to. You only had to pay $20. So consumer surplus, in this case, is $15. So the value you receive above kind of your welfare from this transaction is $15. You're $15 better off by attending the concert than not attending the concert because you thought it was worth $35, you only had to pay $20. Let's go through another example for consumer surplus. We're going to start, starting from the very basics, looking at willingness to pay, looking at how all this interrelates. So willingness to pay for a good, as we've learned before, it's the maximum amount the buyer will pay, which measures the value, right? How much, in the last example, look, favorite musician comes, you're willing to pay $35, that's how you value the product. Well, let's look at four buyers' willingness to pay for an iPod, right? We've got ranging from $125 to $300. Well, these willingness to pays would translate into a demand curve. The overall question we want to look at, if the price is $200, who will buy an iPod? And what is the quantity demanded? Well, Anthony and Flea wouldn't, but Anthony and Flea would indeed buy the iPod. Chad and John would not. Why? Well, the price is $200. Anybody who's willing to pay less than $200, Chad, John, would rather just keep their money. And in fact, if they bought the iPod, they would sustain a loss, right? They view it's worth $175. They have to spend $200. They're worse off by $25. However, Flea and Anthony both think their willingness to pay is over $200, so both of them indeed would purchase the product. So what's the quantity demanded? Price of $200, it's 2. So looking at how do we take this willingness to pay and go to a demand schedule, well, if the price is 301 or more, the quantity demanded will be 0. Before I fill this in, if the price is anywhere between 251 and 300, what do you think the quantity demanded would be? Right? If you were looking at this and realizing, well, Anthony wouldn't buy it for that price, neither would Chad, neither would John, but Flea would. You'd be right. Quantity demanded would be 1. But once you drop down to 250, Flea now wants to buy the product. And in fact, anywhere from 176 to 250, you have a quantity demanded of 2. Once you get to 175, you get a third potential buyer. And for 125 or less, 4 people would buy the iPod. Right? So you could take that information, we could draw in a demand curve. Right? And this demand curve will look more disjointed than what we have drawn as kind of the typical demand curve because we have 4 buyers, right? Only 4 total buyers. It's not going to look nearly as smooth. So demand curve, quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. It is downward sloping, right? This satisfies our law of demand. As the price increases, we see fewer iPods purchased. As the price drops, you see more iPods purchased. So this indeed satisfies our demand curve. The term that Mankiw uses for this is, it looks like a staircase, right? 1 per buyer. Once you start to get a huge number of buyers, it looks more like the smooth curve that we typically will graph. So at any quantity, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer, right? At any quantity. So pick a quantity of 3. How tall is this? 175, right? That's the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer who would leave the market if the price dropped any lower. See, so we've got Flea's willingness to pay, Anthony's willingness to pay, Chad's, and John's. So at 125, John is the marginal buyer, right? He's the 4th person to buy it. But if it goes to anything above 125, he won't buy it anymore. That's why you'd call him the marginal buyer. So how do we translate this to consumer surplus? Well, the consumer surplus equals the difference between the willingness to pay and the price for each buyer who's buying the product. So we know that from our previous graph, and let's go back to that at a price of $260, only Flea is going to buy the iPod, right? At any price from $300 to $251, it'll be only Flea. So that's at $260, that indeed happens. Well, what's Flea's consumer surplus, right? Well, Flea's willing to pay $300. He only has to pay $260. Consumer surplus for Flea is $40. The rest of them don't buy the product, so they get no consumer surplus. They just wouldn't buy the iPod at that price. Therefore, the total consumer surplus, $40. Graphically, right, it's this shaded area is the consumer surplus. $40, the $40 difference times the 1 unit, that's our shaded area, it's the consumer surplus. But what happens now at a lower price, right? $220. At a price of $220, how many people are buying the iPod? Well, I'm hoping by this point in the course with our demand curve, you'll know, well, at $220, of course, now we have 2, right? Flea would buy it. and Anthony would also buy it. So to step back though, two people buy it. Flea is one of them. What is Flea's consumer surplus now? It's no longer $40, right? Flea's willing to pay $300, but if the price is $220, Flea gets $80 in consumer surplus. It's a pretty good deal. What about Anthony? Well, he's willing to pay $250. Very happy to buy it at $220. Anthony gets $30 in consumer surplus. And the total consumer surplus, the sum of the two, $110, and it's represented by the shaded green area on our graph. So the consumer surplus equals the area under the demand curve and above the price. We are going to be drawing in, we'll be seeing the more smooth demand curves and how that works momentarily. But it's the same logic. To measure the consumer surplus, you look at the area under the demand curve and above the price. Right? The consumers get the product for some price that's lower than what they were willing to pay. To measure the area above the price but below the demand curve. So here's the smooth demand curve, right? The more typical demand curve that we'll see. So we say at a quantity of 5, and we're putting these in thousands, the marginal buyer is willing to pay $50, right? 5,000. Those with the lowest willingness to pay are willing to pay $50 for the shoes. But everybody who's buying it is their willingness to pay somewhere between 50 and 60, right? You have some people who are very close to 60. How much consumer surplus are those buyers getting? Well, they're getting almost $10. Others, their willingness to pay is just barely above 50. They're happy to buy it, but they're not getting that much consumer surplus from this. So, what about a price of $30? Well, at a price of $30, the person who's willing to pay $50 gets $20 in consumer surplus. Right? Willing to pay $50, only have to pay $20. What's the total consumer surplus? It's this nice area under the triangle. I'm sorry, it's this triangle under the demand curve and above the price. So this shaded in area represents our consumer surplus. The formula for this, and you'll definitely want to put a little star by this, 1/2 times base times height. It's just the formula for measuring the area of a triangle. 1/2 times base times height. That will allow you to measure the consumer surplus. So before we go any further, why don't you measure the consumer surplus on the demand for shoes on this graph before we go through this together? So go ahead and pause it and make that measurement. Okay, I hope you paused it. What would the consumer surplus be? Well, the base is 15, right? Quantity of 15. You go from 15 to 0, so the base is 15. What about the height? Well, the tallest point on the triangle is 60. The lowest point's 30, so the height is 30. 15 times 30, that is 450. And then, So 15 times 30, 450. Multiply that by 1/2, you get 225. Consumer surplus in this is 225. The base on these is going to equal the quantity on almost every example we go through. The height, sometimes you have to do very simple subtraction, right? 60 minus 30 in this case. But the top point on the demand curve down to the price gives you the height of the triangle. So 15 times 30, that is 450, but then you have to multiply by 1/2 because it's 1/2 times the base times the height. Gives you a consumer surplus of $225. A higher price is going to reduce the consumer surplus. The reason for this fall in consumer surplus, you have some consumers who aren't buying the product anymore, right? You go from a quantity of 15 to a quantity of 10. Well, you have 5 people who used to find it profitable to buy that, who gained consumer surplus, who no longer gain it. But then you have this rectangle here, and what this represents is you had 10 people who were purchasing the shoes before at a price of 30, now are paying 40, right? Every single one of those customers has lost $10 in consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus falls. A higher price reduces consumer surplus. Two reasons. One, everybody who was buying before, who's still buying, has a lower consumer surplus. On top of that, you have some people who've simply just left the market.